The year is 1983. A 21-year-old from Pukerua Bay, small coastal town north of Wellington that you have almost certainly never heard of, is standing in his parents' backyard holding a camera. He has no money, no film school education, no crew. His crew are his friends, doing this on weekends because he asked them to, and nobody said no to him. He has invented a fake blood recipe from food colouring and golden syrup that stains everything and never quite washes out. He will use a very large amount of it. He is going to shoot this film over the next 4 years, a few days at a time, between his day job as a photo engraver at the Evening Post and whatever else life requires. He's going to teach himself lighting, editing, sound design and prosthetic effects, not from books, but from footage he shoots, watches, hates, and then shoots differently. This film is about alien fast food operators who harvest humans for meat. It's exactly what it sounds like. His name is Peter Jackson. In 12 years, he will be one of the most powerful filmmakers on earth. Right now, he is standing in a paddock in Pukerua Bay, covered in golden syrup, and this is where it starts. My name is Matt Dolby, and this is Strange Country. Last week was Australia and the outback as a monster. 3 films across 3 decades making the same buried argument. That a country built on taken land keeps finding that guilt in the landscape. And horror is where it goes to say so. This week, New Zealand. Same ocean, completely different nightmare. Most people, when you mention New Zealand horror, go straight to Peter Jackson. And we are going there. But I want to earn Jackson properly, which means understanding what New Zealand cinema was before he picked up a camera. Because the received wisdom that he invented is one of those things that sounds plausible until you pull on the thread. You see, Peter Jackson didn't start New Zealand horror. He just made it impossible to ignore. His 2 early horror films, Bad Taste and Braindead, are more interesting than their blood count suggests. That's where we're going. New Zealand's relationship with its own horror stories goes back further than most people realise. Ronald Hugh Morrieson was writing gothic horror novels in provincial Hawera, a small town in Taranaki, on the west coast of the North Island in the early 1960s. Pitch dark, deeply strange books set in small towns where the violence underneath respectable surfaces keeps breaking through. The Scarecrow, a serial killer loose in a 1950s town that would rather pretend he doesn't exist. Came a hot Friday, predicament, pallet on the floor. He died in 1972, having published 4 novels, largely unknown, largely unread outside New Zealand. He has been called the New Zealand Flannery O'Connor, which sounds like an overstatement until you read the work, at which point it sounds like an understatement. What Morrieson understood, and what makes him essential to understanding New Zealand horror, is that the darkness in New Zealand is domestic, provincial. It lives in small towns and respectable households, and the gap between what a community presents to itself and what is actually happening behind closed doors. That specific anxiety, the horror of the ordinary, the violence in the familiar, runs through New Zealand horror in a way that has no real equivalent in Australian cinema. Australian horror goes outward, into the landscape. New Zealand horror goes inward, into the house. The Scarecrow was adapted into a film in 1982, a year before Jackson started Bad Taste. So, when people say Jackson invented New Zealand horror, what they mean is he made it visible internationally. Which is true and significant, but it's not the same thing as inventing it. The wider New Zealand film industry was also not nothing. In 1977, Roger Donaldson, later of Cocktail fame in case you needed a data point about range, made Sleeping Dogs, a political thriller about a future New Zealand under authoritarian rule. Sam Neill in a role that established him before the world figured out what to do with him. It was the first New Zealand feature to get a US theatrical release, and it proved the country could make films the world would pay to see. And it also proved something else too, that New Zealand filmmakers were drawn, almost magnetically, towards stories about power, about the state, about what happens to ordinary people when the structures they trusted turn against them. That's not horror by genre, but it's horror by instinct. What followed was a small but real wave. Goodbye Pork Pie, a road movie that treats the New Zealand landscape as a character in its own right, which is what New Zealand films keep doing because they can't help it. Smash Palace, about a man who falls apart in a very specific and very New Zealand way. And then Utu, Jeff Murphy's brutal, brilliant 1983 film about a Māori scout who watches his village massacred by colonial forces and embarks on a campaign of revenge. Utu is a horror film in everything but genre classification. It asks what violence does to a person, what history does to a people, what a country owes the ones it wronged. It is one of the most unflinching films about colonial violence ever made in the Southern Hemisphere. And it came out the same year Jackson was standing in a paddock in Pukerua Bay, covered in golden syrup, thinking about aliens. The funding that made all of this possible existed, quite improbably, under Rob Muldoon. Muldoon ran New Zealand from 1975 to 1984 with the warmth of a man who had been informed that warmth is a sign of weakness. He was suspicious of intellectuals, and he had a particular gift for personalised contempt. He was not by any definition a patron of the arts, and yet the arts funding bodies that existed under his government kept supporting films, because funding bodies have mandates, and Muldoon wasn't paying close enough attention to stop them. New Zealand got a film industry almost by administrative accident, under a Prime Minister who would have despised most of what it made. There is something very New Zealand about that. One more thing. In 1987, Barry Barkley made Ngāti. It was the first feature film directed by a Māori filmmaker. Think about that date. A full decade after Sleeping Dogs, a decade after white New Zealand filmmakers had started telling the country's stories on the screen. The people with the oldest relationship to the land and the most complex body of supernatural narrative in the Southern Hemisphere finally had a camera. Māori mythology is extraordinary. The Taniwha in the rivers, the Patupaerehe in the hills, the Wairua, the spirit world that runs alongside and through the physical one. These are not decorative beliefs. They are a complete framework for understanding what land is, what it demands, and what happens when those demands go unmet. One of the richest supernatural traditions in the world, in a country that was just starting to make films. And for the first decade of New Zealand cinema, it wasn't on screen. That absence runs underneath everything, including Jackson. He was making films in a country whose deepest horror stories hadn't been told yet, not on film, and not by the people who held them. His work exists inside that gap. And the New Zealand horror that comes after him, the films we'll get to later in this series, is increasingly about exactly what was missing. But first, a backyard, some golden syrup, and aliens. Bad Taste is not a masterpiece. I want to be clear about that before I tell you it's one of the most important films in New Zealand history. It is rough in ways that are sometimes charming, and sometimes just rough. The acting is, shall we say, enthusiastic. Most of the cast is Jackson and his friends, which is not a criticism so much as just a description of the situation. What Bad Taste is a demonstration. Jackson shot it over 4 years on weekends, starting on Super 8 and finally upgrading to 16mm when he could afford to. He built his own camera rigs out of whatever was available, and he made the prosthetics himself. He played multiple roles in the film, including a character who, at one point, reaches through a crack in his own skull to scoop his brain back in, simultaneously directing, operating the camera, performing the role, and scooping his own brain back in through a prosthetic he built himself. Now, most film school graduates couldn't match that with a full budget and 30 crew. The New Zealand Film Commission saw the footage and, in one of the smarter decisions in their history, gave Jackson the money to finish it. Bad Taste premiered at the Cannes Film Market in 1988 and sold to distributors in 12 countries. A film shot in a man's parents' backyard over 4 years on borrowed weekends, selling internationally. And here comes the plot. Alien fast food operators harvesting humans for meat. Sounds like something invented at 2 a.m. It was, effectively. But underneath the gore, Bad Taste is doing something quietly interesting. It is set in Pukerua Bay, Jackson's actual home, with real cliffs, real farmland, real grey coastal light. The horror is happening in a specific, recognisable, unremarkable New Zealand place. And that specificity matters. It's not a generic backdrop, it is somewhere. Something about knowing exactly where you are makes what happens there more unsettling than any invented location. There is a sequence midway through Bad Taste where Jackson's character falls off a cliff. Jackson actually fell off the cliff. He shot the fall, climbed back up, then shot the recovery. This is the filmmaking methodology of someone who has decided that the film is more important than personal safety, which is either visionary or alarming depending on your perspective. And I think the answer is both. New Zealand horror almost always does this. It uses the real landscape, makes it specific. The horror is never abstract. It is always happening somewhere in particular. 5 years later, Jackson made Braindead. In the US, it was released as Dead Alive, which is an inferior title, and we're ignoring it. Braindead is what extraordinary promise looks like when given room to run. The budget was around 3 million New Zealand dollars, the largest in New Zealand film history at the time. Jackson had a real crew, real actors, and real sets, and he used all of it, and then some. And now for the plot. Lionel is a repressed young man in 1950s Wellington. He lives with his mother, who is controlling, cold, and treats him less as a son and more as a possession she has chosen not to return. Lionel falls for a girl named Paquita. His mother, disapproving, follows them to the Wellington Zoo, where she is bitten by a Sumatran rat monkey. She becomes a zombie, obviously. Other people become zombies. By the third act, Lionel is standing in his family living room, holding a lawnmower above his head, and the living room is full of the undead. Right, so Braindead holds the record, contested but widely accepted, for the most fake blood used in a film. The lawnmower sequence required 300 litres per shooting day. The cast wore waders. The blood was pumped onto the set through a petrol pump. The production designer has spoken in interviews about the logistics of draining the set between takes, with something approaching the 1,000-year stare of a person who has seen things. But blood aside, Braindead is a film about a man who simply cannot escape his mother. Lionel is a genuinely good person who has been made small by obligation and fear and the daily grind of a woman who needs him to stay small. The zombie transformation isn't incidental. It's the metaphor made literal. She has always consumed him. Now she literally tries to. And when Lionel finally fights back, lawnmower raised, finally done with being reasonable, it is one of the most cathartic moments in horror cinema. Completely absurd, completely sincere, and completely earned. Jackson understood something that most filmmakers working in gore at the time didn't. The set pieces only work if there's something real underneath them. The audience needs to actually want Lionel to win. So Jackson takes the time, more time than you'd expect in a film with a petrol pump full of fake blood, to make sure you do. The setting is doing specific work too. 1950s Wellington. Respectable, buttoned up, a world organised entirely around appearances. The neighbours, the vicar, the nurse, the Rotary Club. Everyone caring enormously about what everyone else thinks. And into this world, a zombie problem in the basement that Lionel is desperately, apologetically trying to manage without anyone finding out. There is a scene early in the film where Lionel's mother dies, or appears to, at a dinner party, and Lionel spends the rest of the evening managing her corpse while the other guests eat dessert. He props her up, he makes excuses, he tries to convince everyone that everything is fine, which is the most New Zealand response to a crisis imaginable. The horror of the scene is real. The comedy of watching a man apologise for his zombie mother's table manners is also real. Both exist at the same time. Jackson never lets either one cancel the other out. That is New Zealand comedy horror at its best. The horror is real, the embarrassment is worse. Braindead was Jackson's last horror film to date. Heavenly Creatures came next, then The Frighteners, then Lord of the Rings, then everything else. He never went back to the genre. He didn't need to. He'd said what he came to say, and said it at a volume that left marks on the walls. So what did Jackson actually do? His horror films gave New Zealand cinema permission. That is not a small thing. Before Bad Taste, the implicit assumption was that you needed resources, infrastructure, industry, things New Zealand just didn't have. And Jackson proved that if the vision was strong enough, the infrastructure could be improvised out of whatever was lying around. You could draw a direct line from him to every filmmaker who has since looked at where they were standing and decided it was enough. There is a problem though, and here's the thing about Braindead as a thesis film. It almost doesn't fit. The colonial guilt argument, the Treaty of Waitangi, the decade-long absence of Māori voices from a cinema built on Māori land, none of that is in Braindead. Jackson wasn't making a film about suppressed history. He was making a film about a man and his mum and a zombie problem in Wellington. And the political reading I've been building towards? He wasn't thinking about it, which is fine. That's not what he was for. The specific fear that runs through New Zealand horror, the thing that makes it distinct from Australian horror, from American horror and from British horror, doesn't come from Jackson. It comes from the country he happened to be making films in. We have to look at the Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840, breached almost immediately, and still being argued over in court in 2026. The land rights movement, the decade-long absence of Māori filmmakers from a cinema being built on Māori land. These are not background context. They are the pressures underneath everything. And what New Zealand horror keeps returning to, across very different films in very different registers, is what happens when you bury something that won't stay buried. Jackson was 21. He was figuring out how a camera worked, making films about aliens, not thinking about the Treaty of Waitangi. But he was making those films inside a country where this was the unspoken weight. and the horror that comes after him is increasingly, explicitly, about exactly what his work circled without naming. Braindead ends with Lionel finally dealing with the thing in the basement. He brings it up to the light, he finishes it. And the house, his mother's house, the house of obligation and guilt and the slow consumption of a person, burns down. As a closing image for what New Zealand horror keeps trying to do, you could do a lot worse. The thing nobody wants to deal with, the debt that compounds in the dark. The moment when someone finally picks up the lawnmower and stops apologising. Australia is afraid of the landscape. New Zealand is afraid of what's been done to it. Peter Jackson didn't make that fear. He just gave it somewhere to live. For the next episode, we're doing something different. 2 episodes in and we've covered almost 100 years of Australian horror and the first decade of New Zealand's film industry. We've established a thesis. We know what these 2 countries are afraid of and roughly why. And now I want to ask the question that sits underneath all of it. Is any of this still true? The Sydney Film Festival runs from the 3rd to the 14th of June. This year it includes a serious focus on new Australian horror. Leviticus, Adrian Chiarella's Sundance breakout about 2 teenage boys in regional Victoria confronted by a shape-shifting entity that takes the form of what they most desire. Saccharine, Natalie Erica James's body horror, a panel on why Australian horror is thriving right now, featuring filmmakers from both films. The most concentrated gathering of people making this kind of work in the country, all in the same building at the same time. Episode 3 is going to be all about the new wave, the directors making Australian horror in 2026, who are, whether they know it or not, in direct conversation with Long Weekend and Wolf Creek and everything in between. What are they afraid of? What has the country given them to work with that Eggleston and McLean didn't have? What has changed, and what, stubbornly, hasn't? The answer, I suspect, is more interesting than it sounds. Australian horror didn't stop when Ozploitation ended. It went underground for a while and came back different. And what it came back as says something specific about what Australia is afraid of now, in 2026, that is distinct from what it was afraid of in 1978. It's going to be a good episode. Probably. Bad Taste and Braindead are in the vault at strangecountry.com.au. Braindead in particular, go find it. There is a sequence involving a lawnmower that I have now referenced 3 times in this episode and still haven't done justice to. You need to see it for yourself. Strange Country. See you then.